All right.
Good. Well, welcome everybody for the webinar this evening, Becoming a Backyard Steward. Our presentation tonight is being done by Keith Thompson, who is with Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. He's the Private Lands Program Manager. He's been with the department for 5 years now, and before he became the Private Lands Program Manager, he was a Chittenden County Forester. So we're really fortunate to have him this evening, and with that, Keith, I'll just go ahead and turn it over to you. Thanks
Great.
for joining us.
Thanks, Kate. Hi, everybody. My name is Keith Thompson, as Kate mentioned, and right now I'm the Private Lands Program Manager. That is basically, my job is basically to help landowners take care of their forests. And I am really excited to do this because I've been spending a lot of time on my own land. I live in Winooski and have a very small property there and have some land up in Underhill. And this is because I feel like webinars, are half classroom, half TV, or radio for that matter. Just wanted to introduce myself and my son Amos. This is a picture of us on our land up in Underhill this past weekend. And we spend a lot of time up there doing some projects that help us connect with the land there and be comfortable, really enjoy ourselves. Today's presentation is about the projects you can do to become a backyard steward. There is really a diversity of things we can do as landowners, and none of them are mandatory, and there's no one way to do it. So this is really a kind of a scatter shot of potential projects to help take care of your land and some things to think about as you're doing that. So to start, stewardship is what I hope every landowner is attempting to achieve when they're working on their own land. And stewardship is really taking care of your woods for the range of things that they provide. It means the habitat for wildlife, clean water, clean air, and just the larger environment, while at the same time offering the things that we as landowners and community members expect from the land. Recreational opportunities, beauty, privacy, food, etc. And stewardship and the love that we've got for the land is really rooted in the land ethic. And Aldo Leopold, folks aren't familiar with him, he's a guy from the beginning part of the century and really the father of the conservation movement. And his approach to land management has really made its way into a lot of the work that we do in forestry and stewardship of the land. And I'll just read this. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively, the land. We can be ethical only in relation to something we can see, feel, understand, love, or otherwise have faith in. And I feel like the opportunity that we have on our own properties, whether it's the size of a postage stamp or 10 acres or 100 acres, the opportunities to embody that land ethic present themselves. And it presents itself in a number of ways. Every single property is really, really important. And so I'm just giving some context for the projects that I'm going to discuss later today or later in this presentation. Vermont's got 88,000 parcels. 48,000 of them are less than 10 acres, which is to say that small properties are a big deal. A lot of Vermont's land are in small properties. And without these small properties, we don't have all the things we expect from our land. Recreational opportunities, wildlife habitat, the scenic beauty that we've got. Small properties contribute in major ways to this. But each small property is really dependent on the benefits of neighboring properties. And this map is a good example. This is the Winooski River in this picture, and the red lines illustrate property boundaries. And several properties line the Winooski River on the south side. And just south on the riverbanks are a number of trees. Those trees provide really important corridors for beavers to move, otters to move, a lot of bird habitat there. But perhaps any one of those properties doesn't provide the things that those wildlife need, or protect the water quality. But cumulatively, together, those properties provide significant habitat. And so in thinking about the projects that you might do on your own land, I just encourage you to think about the context of your own property. To illustrate how this works a little bit more, I'm just suggesting to know and love your land. That'll be the rooting point of the land ethic. And again, to think about it in the broader context of things. As that map showed of the multiple parcels, those multiple parcels contributed to some connectivity. And in the image here, we show two different habitat conditions. We've got the image on the left that shows little islands of habitat along the river, and the image on the right shows contiguous forest cover along the river. That contiguous forest cover offers really important habitat and connectivity for things like I mentioned before, beavers, otters, mink, and does more even to protect the water quality, which is an increasingly an important thing in Vermont, particularly with all the attention being paid to water quality around Lake Champlain. So what this looks like in the real world, kind of in the real world, this is a map of bobcat usage around Shelburne Pond. Bobcat were fitted with GPS collars, and I think this is one or two bobcats around Shelburne Pond. And you can see the areas that these bobcats were using. And you'll notice that along here, these shrub lines provided really important connectivity. While they were denning around here, they moved along these shrub lines, which provided them access to the broader lake for feeding and things like that. So these, we may not see bobcat, but they are out there, and it's important to keep the features that support them on our properties. But getting beyond the landscape level stuff, it's really important to know what's provided on our own property. This helps us understand where our own property fits in with the landscape, and helps us understand what we might do to further support the things that depend on it, and or leave it alone if that's really what's going to serve it well. So one of the first questions to ask is, what trees grow here? Trees providing the foundation of our landscape and habitats are really important. In this picture, my wife Susie is standing next to a really big cherry tree, and in the background there's a number of hemlocks here. Cherry grow really good soft mast, which are really important for birds and at times bears. Hemlock, on the other hand, you can see how the shape of some of these hemlock is a little rough, especially on the right-hand side of the screen. That's because they've been chewed up by porcupine a lot. And so hemlock provide good food for porcupine. During winter time, they are really important cover for deer. So these are things that we could manage for in this little spot. Other things that we might be paying attention to might include what animals we find at a different time of night or a different time of day. So as landowners, we're patterned to be on our property at certain times of day, and we see things consistently at those times of day, or we don't see things consistently at those times of day. In order to get a cool perspective about what your land offers, I encourage folks to get out at night and look around, pay attention to the sounds, get a headlamp and check out not just if there's a deer feeding in the on your garden, but also look closely. This is a picture of a gray tree frog that was in Colchester at about 10:30 at night. And it being there just provides a different perspective about the universe, the small world of life that will use a pretty small habitat, but make it feel really important to me. Other things we might see at night would be spotted salamanders. Right now they're moving a little bit, certainly in the spring. Spotted salamanders and some of the other mole salamanders move from uplands into breeding habitats, into vernal pools, and so they'll be moving from forested hillsides down into wetlands or vernal pools nearby, and they can offer a different perspective about what's needed. The gray tree frog is an amphibian that usually spends most of its time in large trees, and so they'll often be in where the two branches intersect in a large tree. Sometimes they'll be 60 feet in the air, that they can spend the whole season there. Mole salamanders, like the spotted salamander, will spend their summers under rotten logs or in the cavities created by moles beneath the soil, and which just points to some things to keep in mind on your own property. Holding on to big trees, holding on to some down wood, even though it may not jive with your initial aesthetic about what is going to feel beautiful. Perhaps understanding the benefits it provides will make it feel that much more valuable. Another thing to pay attention to would be what you see during different seasons. This is a photo of an otter track where it's slid along a stream course that's underneath the snow. It's looking for openings, perhaps to find salamanders or crayfish. And outside of winter, I would never know that this otter was using this stream, which is just really so small. I would never think that an animal dependent on water like an otter would be using such a small resource, but this is evidence, and there's more than one here, it appears. Also, you can end up seeing certain things that hibernate. Squirrels, maybe not so much anymore in Chittenden County, but some other animals that emerge at different times of the year. The opportunity to see bears, bear tracks as they're moving from the uplands into wetlands, or even to check out people's bird feeders, unfortunately. Seeing what time they're moving can give some insight into how land is getting used and how your land is getting used. So I prefaced this whole presentation with those ideas because once we start taking action on our own land, we can make positive changes and we can support the things that depend on our forest, and we can enhance our own enjoyment of the land. At the same time, if we don't understand how the land is getting used or what is dependent on the land, we can make mistakes without knowing the implications. We might cut a tree that for one reason and not recognize that it was really valuable for something, for the great tree frog. Or we might make a fire pit and then burn all the down wood in the area because it's easy and convenient and accessible, and not realize that that's really important habitat for certain wildlife. It's not necessarily to make really strict rules about it, but just to make sure that we choose our actions on our land with confidence. So start with a light touch and really learn your land. And I think that by doing that, you can make sure that the choices that you make are confident ones. Also, as you do this work and get into some projects, experiment with temporary changes, small things, and then as you get more comfortable and you know your land better, you can be more proactive and perhaps approach much bigger projects. So we've got a couple of questions. Why do we have to do anything, and why not let the land and forest take care of itself? We don't need to do anything, except for the comment that Claire mentioned. I think that barring invasive plants and invasive pests and climate change, the forests have been here for a long time and they can take care of themselves. I'm not of the mindset that things are much better off, that things need to be managed by us in order to be successful. They don't need us. But we do have a history of messing with the land, and people own land, and people make choices on the land to improve their enjoyment of it, to improve the resources as they see them on their own land. And I think in many cases, we can do that stuff on the land as long as we're doing it in such a way that we protect the inherent values of the land, we protect water quality, we protect the diversity of species that occur on the land. The point about the fact that invasive plants are out there, there's a such thing as, at this point, there's a such thing as neglect. If we have one, on the illustration I showed earlier, of those properties along the Winooski River, if one of those properties has invasive plants present, like we've got one stem of Japanese knotweed, if that landowner chooses not to address the presence of that knotweed, it could be that in a couple of years that single stem of knotweed has spread to a large patch. That can be a big problem for the landowner, can be a big problem for the habitat as well. So things are not that cut and dry, and there's no single solution out there. And I think one of the important points of this presentation is that there's a lot of variables to consider as we work with the land, and to approach it with a very humble attitude makes a ton of sense. But for those who are going to be proactive, it's great to think about what are some good options, and what variables do I need to consider as I think about making changes or pursuing a project on my own land. So as we dig into this, I'm going to talk about a couple of really important elements that support wildlife. First one is that wildlife depend on dead trees. There's an instinct that I think dates back to people viewing trees as a crop, and a dead tree is a wasted tree, or a dead tree is a hazard, or a dead tree is ugly. Wildlife depend on dead trees. I've heard a lot of people who have professed love for wildlife say that they only cut dead trees for firewood, and they never bother cutting live trees for firewood. I encourage people to hold on to dead trees where they don't present a hazard to their homes or the families. Dead trees are awesome. And this is a picture of a great horned owl. That was from Heinsberg, a small property in Heinsberg. And it looked like it was probably nesting in the top of a dead white pine tree. Dead trees also offer really important roosting habitat for bats. They will nest underneath exfoliating bark or in cavities. Different kinds of bats have different preferences for the conditions that they'll roost in. For instance, Indiana bat, a federally endangered bat, prefers to roost under exfoliating bark. So a big flake of bark on the side of a tree. Up to 300 bats will climb in there and raise their pups in there during the summer in Vermont. On the other hand, northern long-eared bat, they more often will use cavities in trees, dead or dying trees. If you don't have the dead trees, you can also put up bat boxes. And bat boxes are really great for supporting little brown bats in particular. These are a bat that's really been hit hard by the white nose syndrome. And populations have gone down in a major way. And little brown bats will usually use these bat boxes. There's a lot of resources out on the internet about where to locate bat boxes on a building is often really good. It's great to have it, as the illustration shows here, in a pretty good proximity to forest habitat, because that's a really important place for the food sources that these bats depend on, and close to water. The first thing a bat does every time it leaves its roost is to go drink. In addition to dealing with bats, really thinking about all the different components of a forest or a backyard as potential habitat. And this means big trees, small trees, tall trees, short trees, dead wood on the ground, softwood, hardwood. The diversity of a forest contributes to the diversity of the species using the forest. And the diversity is not just in the species that comprise it, but also in the structure. And when we talk about structure, we're talking about the dead stuff and the living stuff and the height of things. This image is from Audubon, Vermont, and illustrates all the different components of a forest that our forest birds will use. And what I think is really cool about this is it shows how many different things these birds depend on. And it's not just that one bird is using all of these different things. It's that certain birds are really dependent on one or couple elements in the forest. For instance, the black-throated blue warbler will only nest within 5 to 15 feet of the ground. If you don't have woody vegetation that's at that level, then you're not going to be supporting black-throated blue warbler habitat. And there are a number of examples like that. So keeping a diversity of structure in your forest is really important. And brush piles are a good example. Brush piles are really important for rabbits, squirrels, grouse, other critters. It's a good way to organize material if you've got a really small backyard. Instead of perhaps cleaning it all up, you can move it into a brush pile, which can then provide cover for a lot of different critters. It's a small, very easy way to support wildlife on a small property. And making sure that you keep the plants and trees, keep and plant trees that provide food. So if you're not ready to start cutting trees, perhaps planting trees or shrubs that are going to support these birds or other animals. And so, like I said, that cherry tree is a tree that produces soft mast. You may have discussed this already. Soft mast are things like raspberries and blackberries or cherries, really a fleshy fruit. Hard mast would be something like acorns or beech nuts. And the difference between the two is that soft mast is often very sugary, high energy stuff, and helps animals at a certain part of their life, whereas the hard mast, the acorns and beech nuts and things of that sort, are really high in fats, and they're really good heading into a long winter or preparing for long winters, particularly where they're good. And here's a picture of that black-throated blue warbler. Many folks in their backyards are really interested in clearing out the low brushy vegetation. I think myself included have a sense that open space feels good on my own land, and that is what it is. And that low woody vegetation can get in the way of that and make it feel like a thicket, and make you feel like you've got less space. But knowing that it's got value can help you kind of balance out where to leave the woody vegetation or if to cut it at all. Again, invasive plants were already mentioned, and I think in no case is leaving dense invasive plants in place really beneficial in the long term. It might support some nesting habitat in the short term for certain birds, but in the long term, we've got a lot of trees and shrubs, native trees and shrubs that can provide that habitat. So I really encourage people to get rid of invasive plants. And I just want to go back to the point about the mast tree, and actually the next slide comes back to that. I was talking about soft mast and hard mast. And again, mast refers to the fruit that these trees provide, and I guess it's wildlife jargon, but it's a good food source, and trees that provide a good food source are considered important mast trees. The image here is this is a mast tree, and this is an American beech. And up the entire side of this beech tree, which is about 24 inches in diameter, are bear claw marks. And these bears are going up these trees every year in order to eat the beech nuts that are in the canopy, and they do this in advance of their hibernation every year. And you won't always see this kind of bear scarring, but you may, and you may not just see it on beech, and you may not just see it from bears, but you may see it on serviceberry, which is a common tree throughout Chittenden County and throughout the state. You may see it from gray foxes, you may see it from raccoons or other animals that are climbing the trees. And so paying attention to the stems of the trees on your property to see if they're getting used. There can be telltale signs of that. Other mass trees are cherry trees, oak trees, and in some cases, people will even consider maple trees as a mass tree that are important for wildlife. So it's not just the food, but it's also cover. So softwood in particular is really important. For wildlife. It provides a lot of important thermal values for wildlife. It holds the heat and it intercepts the snow. So beneath the softwood cover, you've got less snow depth, and it's usually a couple of degrees warmer. And while that doesn't feel all that significant to us, for a lot of animals trying to survive a winter with limited food resources, a couple of degrees can make a huge difference. Just coming back to this, when we're talking about cover and talking about travel corridors, just kind of brings us back to what are important places that get used. The arrows here show that the mixed softwood cover is really important for the bobcat habitat. The shrub lines on the right-hand side of the screen are really important for travel corridors, and that the wetlands are really important for finding food for the bobcat. And so on your own property, this Shelburne Pond itself is a really big landscape level feature, but even on smaller scales, a small vernal pool or a small stream or seep on your property can be a really important feature on that property, or even within in the landscape, and helping animals move through the through residential or developed areas. So we can manage for wildlife. We can also manage for activities or products from our own land. And the food movement that we've got going on in Vermont is really great. And there are some opportunities that present themselves on our own land on a small scale to harvest some products from our own land. And one of the classic ones, certainly sugaring, is a really important one. And so historically, folks have always said you only tap sugar maple, but recent research has shown that red maple too is often worth tapping. It's got sugar maple is more consistent in its sugar content. So, you've got to boil down 40 gallons of sap in order to make a gallon of syrup. That can sometimes be true with red maple as well. In other cases, it might take more sap from red maple to make a gallon of syrup. But a lot of people have entire sugar bushes now, only harvesting sap from red maples. So sugar maple and red maple are the best. People will also sometimes tap silver maple. I haven't done that myself, but I hear it's possible. Some people who don't have their own evaporator will use a turkey fryer, or use that outside in the garage, or some folks will even have somebody weld the bottom of a sink shut. That was my first evaporator about 15 years ago, and it worked great. If you're thinking about cutting your own firewood, this is one of my principles for managing forests and cutting trees, that it's not as much about what you're cutting as what you're growing. When we cut a tree, we're working to manage the resources of the neighboring trees. And in most cases, we shouldn't be cutting a tree because that's the resource that we're yanking out of there. We should be cutting a tree because it's going to help something else to grow better. So a really good approach to this is thinking about this, we call it crop tree release. And so again, we're not talking about what tree we want to cut, we're talking about what tree we want to grow. So we identify a tree that either looks really great on our property, or it's a mast tree. It has the potential to produce a lot of nuts and really support wildlife, or it's a great saw timber tree and has the potential to produce a lot of value. And so in order to support the growth of this tree, and the growth depends on light and space and water, we give it some more light and we give it some more space by cutting the trees around it. And one way to think about this is imagine that a tree has 4 sides. And if you release it on at least 2 of those 4 sides, you can expect the tree to grow better. And in terms of firewood, keep in mind that dry wood burns better, creates less pollution, less creosote buildup on your chimney. And that in terms of burnability, not all woods are created equal. Hardwoods are much better than softwoods, and even among hardwoods, there can be major differences. But a huge number of Vermont families harvest their own firewood, and I think it's actually a really important way for Vermont landowners to stay connected to their forests. It gets them out in there and paying attention to their forests, and oftentimes engaged with foresters who can share other points about the values of their forest, things to pay attention to related to water quality, timber value, and wildlife habitat. More and more people are beginning to grow mushrooms, and shiitake mushroom is a mushroom that can always buy at the store, but it's one of the most common ones that people are cultivating. People also cultivate oyster or lion's mane mushrooms, and these mushrooms can be grown from small logs that are harvested either during a firewood harvest or acquired in some other way. And this guy you can see here for shiitake mushroom, 4 to 8 inch logs, about 4 feet long, are cut up and a bunch of holes are drilled in each one. And you can buy something called spawn. It's basically sawdust that's been inoculated with a mushroom. You can just get it off the internet. And each of the holes drilled in the logs are filled with this spawn. And then you cover it with wax. And then you water it, or at least keep it moist. And then within a year, you can dunk those. You really soak them one day, and pretty soon they'll start pumping out mushrooms, and they can last several years, each of these logs, and produce several pounds of mushrooms. So this is something that a lot of folks are exploring as a hobby, and some folks are getting into it commercially. And then other folks who are really getting into just using the materials from their forest. This is tapped sugar maple. So a landowner who had an old sugar maple on his property milled it up, and then turned it into his desk at his office. And he's really enjoyed being able to have wood from his own land on a tree that fell down continue to serve him, and it's got a story behind it, and it's incredibly, incredibly beautiful. There are some really simple things that I think anybody can do that can help them connect to their own land. And so if you're not interested in manipulating the environment or harvesting products, these are things that can help us just enjoy what's out there. I feel that one of the simplest things any of us can do is to create a space in the woods to be still, connect with people in the place, and building a fire ring on a property in itself can be a really great project, especially if you get really creative with the stones and the layout of a fire ring, and really make it a special place. And there's really not anything more classic than hanging out around a fire. Building a tent platform, or even just a weatherproof box out in the woods that can hold and store the things that you need to be comfortable out in the woods, can make it easy for yourself to get out there away from the house, even if it's just a couple of hundred feet. And so again, this is getting back to creating something that is really attractive to get you out in the woods and make it as easy as possible to step out and be comfortable and enjoy the outside. Again, trails are a similar thing. It's one thing to bushwhack through the woods and see all the great things, but the convenience and ease and flow that comes with a well-designed trail provides us things that a lot of us don't get in terms of exercise and the opportunity to see large areas. A lot of small properties don't have the area necessary to have a trail that really feels substantial. And so I really encourage people to partner with neighbors to establish recreational opportunities like this. I think this is happening more and more on large scales, but I think that there are opportunities to do it on small scales as well. Got a question here that says, if I have a road in my woods that gets wet sometimes during the year, would it be better to leave the trees that shade the road and drink up the groundwater, or cut the trees and let the sunlight in? I think this applies equally well to trails. Not knowing where that water comes from, and not knowing when that road is wet, I would expect that there's a drainage issue, and that trees are moving more water than sunlight will evaporate, and that addressing the drainage issue might be the most important thing. But again, the details and the circumstances that cause a wet road are something that would need to be determined on site before being able to say exactly what's going to work best. Then another simple recreation thing is bird watching. It's something that is around us all the time, birds, and with a simple pair of binoculars and a birding app for your smartphone and a little practice, even a novice can get familiar with the birds using our environment quickly. There are free apps that can show us what a bird looks like. You can play songs of the birds. Some of the apps have look-alike birds, so you can figure out if it's one bird or another. And so I encourage anybody to take a look at some of the apps that are out there. Even if you're not actively birding, I find myself kind of inspired by a bird out in the woods and I have no idea what it is, and I'll take a moment, check out my phone, and sometimes by playing the call, I'll even get a bird to call back or come closer to me. And so it's a really cool way to not just kind of check out, hear it, appreciate it, and then walk away. I can hear it and learn it, and then understand more about the space. I can understand what habitat this certain bird is using, which gives me a bigger picture and a bigger appreciation, not just for the bird, but how it interacts in the community it's using. So this is coming back to the structure I was discussing, and this is the illustration of which birds are using which habitats. Again, here is the black-throated blue warbler in the lower left. This is using that low vegetation for nesting habitat. Veery too will use low vegetation, often nesting on the ground, or but will often be adjacent to wetland areas. Chestnut-sided warbler is a bird that will nest near the ground, but it does it usually in openings up to an acre. Yellow-bellied sapsucker is a bird that's really dependent on nesting in cavities. And eastern wood pewee is a bird that will often, it's a flycatcher, and it will perch in areas that have a small opening adjacent to it, and it will kind of leap out from a perch and catch an insect and then fly back. And so small openings are really important for wood pewees. So as you do or pursue any project, I think it's really important to do it safely. A good idea can turn into a bad idea in a hurry, and getting hurt is a quick way to turn it into a bad idea. One of the coolest classes I ever took was a chainsaw safety class, and I think it was really cool because I was incredibly uncomfortable around a chainsaw, and yet as a forester, comfort with a chainsaw is really important. This class I took, which was the game of logging, had a huge number of people who had never cut down a tree in their life, who were cutting down leaning trees on a target by the end of the first day. And they did that by breaking down the process of using a chainsaw and cutting down a tree into a simple recipe that was really simple and really easy for anybody to do. And so I really encourage anybody who's looking to pursue a project to take one of these classes. It's $150, and it is the best $150 you'll spend on any class. I think it's the best $150 I spent on a class. Also, especially in Chittenden County, know your poisonous plants. Poison ivy is out there all over the place. Nothing worse than having you or your kid run into poison ivy. Increasingly, poison parsnip is out there, particularly in our fields. It's really all over the place right now, which is a sad thing. Poison parsnip, you'll note by the yellow flowers. It's got almost looks like Queen Anne's lace, but it's got a sap that is reactive to the sunlight, and when you get the sap on you, it's really turns into a chemical burn, which can be really nasty. And ticks. Anybody who's been in Vermont for more than a few years has realized that the tick numbers have gone way up, and the incidence of Lyme disease is going up. there are a huge number of ticks that are carrying Lyme disease, and in some places as high as 80% of the deer ticks are carrying it. So after you get in from the woods, if you know there are ticks out there, check yourself just to be confident. If you've had a tick in you for more than 24 hours or for less than 24 hours, you're probably safe. Pull it out and you're going to be okay. If it's been in for longer and it's engorged, then it may be something that you want to get in touch with your physician about. Certainly paying attention to the point where you were bitten is worth doing. And then finally, we've got invasive plants. First thing and most important thing is to prevent invasive plants. Know what your invasive plants are. Go to btinvasives.org. Every place that I've seen an infestation, I feel like, you know what, there was a point at which this was preventable. All it took was somebody yanking a plant and it could have been stopped. In a place like this, in a forest like this, where it's non-existent, just a casual walk through the woods and occasional hand pulling is all that you need. If you recognize a small patch of invasive plants, it can be eliminated before it becomes a problem. In the background here, we have, this is Phragmites. It's actually a pretty beautiful grass. We see huge densities along the interstate, and in many cases, it's taking over really important wetland habitat where it's really out competing cattails and other wetland vegetation. And it grows in a big monoculture and really reduces the diversity of wetland areas, so that's important to get rid of. And where they get really heavily established, control the spread. This is a place in Huntington where the barberry is spread a lot. Barberry can really support high tick populations, so there's a double incentive to control it. And it can really impact both wildlife habitat and the health of the forest. So just to recap, things to do for wildlife are protect dead trees, create brush piles, support the food resources on your habitat, and protect the cover and connectivity that your property provides for wildlife. What each of those things mean really depends on the species that you're managing for. So if you see an animal on your land, it's really worth digging into the Fish and Wildlife website or other resources to understand what it is that these animals depend on and what it is about your property that they might be using. Stewardship activities for products. We've got sugaring, tapping maple trees, harvesting your own firewood, and again, focusing on what you're growing, not what you're cutting. And if you do that, you'll always be improving your land, growing mushrooms, and creating handicrafts from down trees or vines or things that are growing on your own land. Things just to keep yourself connected to the land and enjoying that space, building campfires, building trails with your neighbors, getting out bird watching. And again, make sure that whatever you're doing safely. Taking the game of logging or another SAW safety class, making sure you're keeping an eye out for poison ivy or other poisonous plants, and really protecting yourself from ticks, being vigilant about wearing DEET or wearing permethrin-covered clothes, and checking yourself when you come in from the woods. As strange as it sounds, now is a really likely time to be finding ticks. And so if you're out in the woods this weekend, make sure you check yourself after you come in. And then finally, invasive plants. Prevention is the best thing. Know the invasive plants by checking out VT invasives. One thing that is really good is working with your community. Invasive plant spreads. So if you don't have them on your property, but you know they're down the road, then they're likely on their way. Working with folks working together to get rid of them where they're getting established is a really great thing to do. Where there are small populations, eradicate them. And where there are really dense populations, do some mitigation. Keep an eye on where they're at and work hard to make sure that they don't spread. So that is the end of the presentation. I want to thank everybody for their time. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, thank you so much, Keith. Such a wealth of information that you presented this evening. And I'll give folks, we have a minute or so for any questions. I'm sure you've provided so much information this evening. I'm sure folks are going to have more questions as they dive deeper. I was reflecting and thinking about the goal of the presentation this evening was really just to whet your appetite. And so Keith covered a lot of different ways that you can become more engaged in the stewardship of your backyard. And a lot of these topics are actually linked off of Module 3. So if you follow the module, you'll find some more information and some additional resources, many of which Keith mentioned in the module itself. So the presentation this evening is a start, but we'll be covering this over the next 2 weeks. And please feel free to reach out to me, or I'll be happy to get you in touch with Keith as you have more questions, or your county forester, or the resources that are out there as you have more questions on these topics. So I'm not seeing any questions coming into the chat box. Keith, do you have any questions on your end coming into your chat box?
No, I don't.
Okay. It seemed like at one point there, folks were sending messages to you directly. So I just wanted to confirm. And so seeing no questions, again, just a reminder, folks, that we'll have our backyard field day on Saturday. And that'll be another opportunity to get out in the woods and share some of your thoughts and share some of your experiences. We'll go for a walk with the county foresters, so you'll have an opportunity to meet the Addison and Chittenden County foresters. And then in the afternoon, we're going to do some skill building sessions. So we'll do tree identification. We'll spend some time looking at invasive plants. And we'll also spend some time thinking about some of the decisions that we make as managers and stewards of our woods. And Chris Olson, our county forester in Addison County, will kind of walk you through how he makes decisions and hopefully shed some light on that for you. So that's it for the webinar this evening. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you on Saturday. Have a good evening, everybody, and thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks again, Keith.